You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 23. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my extraordinary friends, and welcome back to the podcast. For anybody who's joining for the first time, welcome. My name is Paula Price. I'm a lawyer turned certified executive coach and the host of this podcast. I just wanted to say I'm so happy to be recording today's podcast episode. I'm normally pretty content when I sit down to do this, but it is a rainy Wednesday morning here in Vancouver. I just dropped the kids off at school, and I'm pretty excited to talk about today's topic. I normally am. And before I jump into anything, I really wanted to acknowledge and extend my appreciation to all of you who are joining me for these podcasts. I had the pleasure of reconnecting with an old friend last week who has been listening to the podcast, and she was sharing with me some of the elements of podcast episodes that really resonated with her. And it means so much to me to hear your feedback, to hear how things that I'm sharing with you are resonating with you and helping you in the various aspects of your professional life, in your personal life. And I wanted to acknowledge each of you because I know from my experience of speaking with you, with those of you who have reached out to connect with me, how much of an impact you're making. I know you are all sitting there or standing there quietly achieving really incredible things. You're going after your dreams. You are really making an impact in your professional realms, in your families. And sometimes you can do that work and not really feel like anybody is noticing. And I just want to be that voice for you today, that person who acknowledges all the things that you're doing and to say, I think you're doing an amazing job. And thank you so much for being here with me. I am so delighted to have your support. So thank you and keep up the great work. Now, I will be talking about decisions and self-trust and your gut. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention that I've got a series of webinars that I'm doing. They are free, and the first webinar has already taken place. That one was about reimagining your practice. If you joined me, wonderful. I hope you really enjoyed it. There's another one coming up on November 12th, which is called Decluttering Your Desk, Your Calendar, and Your Habits, which, as you might imagine, is all about streamlining. So I'm really excited to be talking to you about that. I've recently started doing some decluttering of my own, and it's really interesting to see what that's bringing up for me. And so I'll be sharing some of that with you in the podcast and also in that webinar. So that's November 12th. And finally, on December 3rd, there will be a third and final webinar. And that webinar is all about amplifying your impact. So once you've reimagined your practice, you've set a goal for yourself, you've cleared the decks, then it's time to really step into what it is that you want to accomplish. And it can be difficult to take that step. There can be a lot of invisible tripwires that come up. Maybe it's fear or perfectionism or any number of things. And so that third and final webinar will be devoted to that. So I would love to have you join. Please, if it is of interest to you, go to the podcast notes for this particular episode. It's episode number 23, and you'll find the links to register. So please go ahead and do that. So turning to today's topic, I wanted to share an experience that I had recently because I think it is so relevant to what happens in your day-to-day, whether it's in your professional work or whether it's in your personal life. So the example I'm going to use is my painting project. And if you listen to last week's episode, then you'll know that I repainted my home office space from yellow, which nothing wrong with yellow, but this particular shade just was not serving. It wasn't doing it for me any longer. I don't think it ever had. It was painted that way when we initially moved into our house. And I really wanted to brighten this room and paint it a nice white. And so I talked about this last week, how I spent a day on the Thanksgiving long weekend here in Canada dedicated to painting this room. And the aftermath of that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. And I wanted to go into this in more detail. I know that sounds really exciting, doesn't it? Let's go down the rabbit hole together. But I want to take you into the rabbit hole because there are so many valuable lessons that came out of it. And I want to share those lessons with you and invite you to think about how these lessons are applicable in your own respective areas, whether it's your practice, whether it's your personal life, and some of the lessons that you can draw from it and apply them in your own life so that you're not making the same mistakes or thought errors that I was making. So to give you a little bit more context, I went to paint the walls in my house. And the first thing that I needed to do that was paint. So I drove out the other weekend to my usual paint store, and the paint store was actually closed. It was closed indefinitely. I gather they're switching ownership, and so I had to find paint from a different source. And I went to a store that's a little bit closer to my house. It's not exclusively a paint store. I don't want to give too many details because I don't want to throw them under the bus. I don't think they've done anything wrong here, but I don't want to give that impression. So I went to the store and, on my way there, I saw this sign. The sign said, "Live every day like something wonderful is about to happen." So I was really in a good mood. I was thinking, okay, something wonderful is about to happen. So I got to the store and I found the paint section. I looked at all the different shades of white. It turns out there are many, many, many different shades of white. So I picked something. And then I found a gentleman there who could help me get the paint because they keep it somewhere where you can't really access it. And so he did that. He complimented my color choice, said he'd actually painted a wall or a room in his house by that same color. I thought, oh, that's great. I felt so good about it. And he disappeared into the back. And a couple of minutes later, he reappeared and he said, if you're okay with not going with the eggshell, I can offer you a paint that is just off of eggshell, which will look the same on your walls for 20% off. And I said, okay, that sounds fine. He seemed really enthusiastic. I trusted his opinion. So I said, that sounds great. Let's do that. A couple of minutes later, he came back a second time and he said, you know what? There is paint in our supply area that has a different label on it. So if you're okay with paint that has a different label on it, I can give you the paint for $5 for each container. And I gather the paint is normally $50 or $60 for each container. So this was a deep discount and he was really excited. And so I said, okay, that sounds really great. Sure, $5 for a can of paint. Why not? And I had this moment where I kind of remembered situations that I've had in the past where paint has actually been expired. And so I asked him about that. I said, well, I've had this situation in the past where paint has been expired. Is there any chance that that's going to be a problem here? And he said, no, it's just a relabeling issue and nothing to be concerned about. So off he went to prepare this paint and I was excited. I thought, wow, that sign was right. Something wonderful was about to happen to me. And isn't this great? I get my paint for $5 per can. And I went off and looked around the store and picked up a few more items while I went to wait for my paint. So that's the backstory of how the paint came into my possession. I picked up the paint, took it home, and proceeded to paint the walls. Now, the thing I want to share with you is what happened after I painted the walls. And the reason that I'm sharing this with you is because it's all about decision making and how sometimes we make a decision, we feel great about that decision, and then something happens that causes us to second guess ourselves, that start to doubt our decisions. So I'm going to identify step by step because I think that some of these might resonate for you in terms of decisions that you may have made in your personal life, in your practice. So the first thing that kind of threw me off was my husband coming home with the children and making a comment about the paint. Now, to me, painting is just an exercise that is kind of, it's neither here nor there. It's a little bit smelly and you have to be pretty precise and there's all this paint and you have to cover the floors, etc. So, of course it smelled to me. It smelled like paint. And he came home and he said, that paint kind of smells like it smells musty. It doesn't smell like normal paint. And then he told a story about some painting he'd done recently in his office where the paint smelled so amazing that he was wanting to go back into that room to smell the fresh paint smell. And all of a sudden I started to second guess myself. And I thought, oh my gosh, like maybe this paint was off. Maybe this whole $5 business was not so great after all. So the reason that I mention this is that up until that point, I'd had no concerns about the paint. I was happy. It was a good deal. It was the right color. I mean, I mentioned last week that maybe it didn't totally clear up the yellowness that I was trying to uncover, but that's a whole other story. We're not going to get into that now. Bottom line, I was really content with the results until I had this feedback about the paint maybe being off. So you might ask yourself where this has come up for you. For example, it might be that you are making a decision on a file. You decide to go with a particular strategy on a file and you're talking with a supervising lawyer or another lawyer in your office, and maybe they say something that causes you to think, wait a second, maybe that wasn't such a great idea after all. And I know that I've had conversations back when I was practicing where, there's a lot of different opinions about how a file should be run, and the practice of law is not a science, it's an art. And really the circumstances depend on the person who's involved, the lawyer who you could go different ways on a file. And it's not to say one is correct and one is not correct. But when you have that negative feedback from somebody else, it can start to cause you to question whether or not the decision that you made in the first place was correct. And so you might think about where that may have come up for you, where you've made a decision, you were great with that decision, and then all of a sudden you start to get some negative feedback, and it maybe will start to cause you to second guess what's going on. So that was the first thing that happened. Now, the second thing that happened that started to really undermine my decision was discomfort. And now, for the past week and a half, my office space has had a paint smell. And every time I've gone to sit in the office to work, it causes me to be a little bit uncomfortable, right? There's that weird smell, gives me a bit of a headache. Then I start going down the mental rabbit hole of, did I buy the right paint? Maybe this was a big mistake. And it was the discomfort that really started to further cause me to second guess my decision. And the reason that I want to highlight this in particular is that discomfort is such a huge part of growth. And it's not to say that I'm going to undergo some major transformation because I painted the walls in my workspace, but anytime you make a decision that pushes you outside your comfort zone, chances are it's going to bring up discomfort. And I think we often take that discomfort as a sign that something has gone wrong. So if you think about, for example, if you decide that you are wanting to develop your public speaking skills and you start volunteering to speak at conferences or internal presentations at your organization or your law firm, and you go to do these presentations and it's difficult to prepare for them, you're nervous while you're presenting, that can make you think, well, I'm uncomfortable, so I really should not be doing this. Or maybe it's a new job that you're looking for or a promotion that you're seeking, or maybe you want to negotiate a more generous compensation at the organization where you are. And so there's all these challenges that may come up for you, or these decisions that you're making where the thing that you'll have to do is going to cause you discomfort. And so you interpret that as a sign that you shouldn't do it. And so in this case, the discomfort that came up for me was, of course, sitting in this room and wondering, did I make a mistake here? So that's something that might come up for you in terms of decisions that you make, and you may start to second guess yourself because of the discomfort that you feel. Now, the third thing that happened as a result of this decision, and this kind of followed the negative feedback and then this physical discomfort, was the internal "I told you so." Right? And how many times has that happened to you where you've made a decision and maybe there was a part of you that was like, hey, maybe this isn't the best decision. And in my case, that was the voice that kind of came out during that conversation with the salesperson, which was, what if the paint is expired? So all of a sudden, my inner gut, the inner paint expert in me, which I actually am not at all a paint expert, clearly, was saying to me, well, Paula, of course you should have known, right? Like anybody who's selling you $5 paint, of course it's going to be expired. I told you so. And this really is your inner I told you so reflex, which in hindsight maybe makes sense. Now, in this case, I actually don't think that my gut sense was necessarily correct. I don't think there was anything wrong with the paint. We can talk more about that. But it's that instinct where you start to really anchor in on something that you were thinking or something that you told yourself that kind of second guesses or undermines the decision that you've made. So maybe this has happened to you in a situation where, for example, maybe you're in a job, for example, and you decide to go to a new one and you have some reservations about going into that new job because you start out and it's not exactly what you'd anticipated. And so you kick yourself. You say, well, of course this didn't work out because I knew from the outset, and then you fill in the blank. And it's not to say that the decision that you made is wrong. It may just mean that there's a tweak that is required, but it can be easy to latch on to a thought that actually this was not the right thing. You may find this in the work that you do. When I was practicing as a lawyer, there were times where I would have an instinct on something and I would then voice that, and we would have, I'm thinking about when I worked on a team, for example, and maybe it's something that I raised with another lawyer. And ultimately we decided, well, let's not worry about that. And then it came back and was something that would have benefited from further investigation. That has happened. Conversely, I've also had it where, I've had an instinct and I've gone with that instinct and it's turned out to be something that was really helpful. So you may have situations like that where you have this instinct and you follow it or not. Where this can also come up is, you realize based on what has happened, what truly matters to you. So in this situation, I was thinking, to me, the cost of the paint, whether it's $100 or $10, isn't really the issue. The issue for me is I'm spending the time to make this room the color that I want. What is important to me is that I get it right, not how much money I save. And so it's being more clear on what matters to you in a particular situation. And what can be helpful about that is that it can help you with your direction and to stay on course versus situations where you might get pulled off that course because of somebody else's enthusiasm. So in this case, for example, when the salesperson was so enthusiastic and I was getting enthusiastic, right? I mean, it's super contagious when somebody is really excited about something and so are you. It can be really easy to want to follow a path that may not match up with what your gut is really telling you. So this is a tricky one, right? I think your gut is something that you should listen to. Whether or not you should follow that is another question. But what I'm trying to flag here, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the lessons to take away from this experience. The idea here is for you to notice when you make a decision and all of a sudden it's like that part of you is like, I told you so. And I just want you to notice that I told you so voice may not actually be correct. So that was the number 3. There are 5. The next one is sometimes you make a decision and you start to then distract yourself or ruminate over that decision. So the way that showed up here is, here I am, I'm in the smelly room and I kind of have a headache. And then I start to get kind of obsessed about the smell of the paint. And so what happens? I start to Google. I go to Google and I start asking it questions about paint and should it smell and how to get rid of the smell? How long is it going to smell? So I started spending all this time going down the rabbit hole of research. Then I found the smelly candles that we happened to have in the house and we had 2. So I started burning those candles. I started, alternating between candles burning in the room and opening the window and turning on the heat, turning off the heat, all these different combinations to try to get rid of the smell. I think it only made the room smell worse, frankly, having these candles going. Then I also started doing something that we might start doing, you might relate to, is opinion shopping. So I started asking friends, hey, I've just painted this room and it still smells. Is that normal? And you might be able to relate to this, right? You, in your practice, maybe it's a file that you're working on. There's a particular strategy that you're using to negotiate an agreement or a way that you're handling a particularly difficult client. And you start to ask yourself whether you made the right decision, and you start kind of seeking out other people's opinions. It's almost like if other people are in agreement with you, then you've made the right choice. And what's so interesting about that part of it is that when I got different opinions, it had such an effect on how I viewed the room. So for example, one friend said, oh no, that sounds a little bit sketchy. Like that's not normal. Maybe you should go back and see if there's anything they can do to fix it. Another friend that I asked who had painted recently said, oh yeah, no, we painted and it was super smelly. We even bought that low emission paint and, we had the fans going. So when I heard that, I thought, well, that's great. That means that this is totally normal. So your opinion about what the decision that you've made can change depending on the feedback that you get from others. And so what I want to highlight here is that here's the decision that I made. Now I'm out there, and not only am I sitting in a room that smells stinky from the paint, but I've also started to spend a lot of time ruminating, second guessing myself, opinion shopping, doing research, and it's not really moving the dial forward. It's just really taking time away from what I really want to do, which is be productive in my workspace. So finally, the last sort of consequence that I want to highlight here was that as a result of all this, I started to experience self-doubt. Now, don't worry, I wasn't really getting too far into it over a can of paint or 2 cans of paint. But here's what I started to experience. I started to think, this really serves me right. I should have known better that this paint was going to be off. I mean, really, who am I to be doing this? And it wasn't even worth it. Like maybe I would have been better off not painting the room. And you can see how this might happen for you in situations where you are putting yourself out there, where you've made a decision. Maybe it's a decision on the file and you put yourself out there and you don't get the outcome that you want. And so you start second guessing yourself. Oh, maybe I just shouldn't have made the decision. Maybe I should have asked for somebody else to give me their opinion. Maybe it's, you're reaching out and trying to network and connect with people and you don't get the response that you want. And so you beat yourself up, or you have a conversation with somebody and it turns awkward. And then you leave that conversation thinking, that was all my fault. I'm terrible at this. So the effect of all of this is that it leads to this place where you start to really doubt your decisions. Now, this is just the paint. I can happily report that almost 2 weeks later, this room doesn't smell nearly as bad. Yes, it still smells, but I'm pretty confident that the paint was fine, that the man who sold it to me really, truly, and I totally believe that he was doing this out of the goodness of his heart, and I appreciate it. And I really wish I could get back to that moment because I really enjoyed that whole experience. It was like everybody was winning. But what I want to highlight here is how that one decision led to this almost fallout of subsequent decisions and how it kind of undermined the decision that I had made. And so the next part of this podcast, I want to highlight what the lessons were that came out of this experience. So there are 5. And lesson number 1 is anytime that you make a decision, whether it's a decision on a file, whether it's a career decision that you're making, whether it's a strategic move that you're making with your children, anybody who's out there parenting, you know that there are so many decisions that you're making on behalf of your children every day. I think those warrant consideration. Or parents, if you've got aging parents and you're making decisions on their behalf, anytime you make these decisions, you are making decisions based on the information that you have. And what is going to happen is that somebody out there is very likely going to have an opinion about what it is that you're doing. And what I encourage you to do is anytime that you're making a decision that is of consequence, where you anticipate that there may be negative outcomes for other people, is to shore yourself up ahead of time and really give yourself that confidence that the decision that you're making is the right decision for you. It doesn't mean it's the perfect decision. It doesn't mean that nothing's going to go wrong. It just means that you're not going to allow yourself to get caught up in the comments that others have. Now, this is not to say that my husband wasn't, that there was anything wrong with him commenting on the paint. That was his opinion. That's not the issue. People are entitled to have opinions and they will share those opinions with you. The thing that I'm asking you to focus on here is your own response to that opinion. And so that is lesson number one, is to really shore yourself up and to be okay with the fact that there are others who may not agree with the choice that you've made, but that you have your own back, that you are going to be okay with your decision no matter what. And if you need to change something, you can always do that down the road. So the second lesson that comes out of this experience is the lesson of discomfort. And I've spoken about this before on the podcast. I've coached clients around this numerous times, and I highly encourage everybody out there to develop a practice of really learning to manage discomfort. So this experience for me was a little bit different from the discomfort that I've been training myself with. I, as a coach, have a practice where I deliberately put myself in uncomfortable situations because I believe that that's what makes me grow. I encourage clients to do that as well. I have had a journaling practice, which I shared with some clients, and they've actually adopted it and they seem to really enjoy it. I don't do it every day, but I journal for discomfort. So I might say in the morning, the discomfort that I'm willing to feel today is the discomfort of, trying something new, speaking in public, putting out a new product, whatever that happens to be. But it's really giving yourself instructions ahead of time that you are going to embrace something uncomfortable because of the growth that comes on the other side of it. So in this case, I'm not so sure that sitting in a smelly, painty room is the kind of discomfort that I would normally go for. However, I think the parallel here is that sitting in the room made me physically uncomfortable. And that discomfort is what caused me to second guess my decision. And for you, you may make a decision to go after a big goal, and the next thing you know, you're super uncomfortable because you're taking steps that are way outside your comfort zone. And that might seem to you like a signal like you're on the right path, not on the right path. And my advice to you, or the lesson that I drew from this experience, is sometimes it's just uncomfortable, and that's okay. That is part of the process. That, my friends, is lesson number 2. Lesson number 3 is that, and this is where we were talking about that gut sense, right? That you're kind of, your gut is telling you, I told you so, and you shouldn't have done this. The lesson here is that your gut is such a strong indicator of what is important to you. So when you are making a decision about doing something, I strongly encourage you to do that gut check. In this case, for example, my takeaway was, don't buy the cheap paint if it's not what you truly want. And I'm not saying that paint wasn't the right paint, but the importance to me of getting the thing that I really wanted was way more important to me than buying something at a discount. And the parallel that you may have in your life may be that you are selling yourself short in particular areas. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's at home, maybe it's with yourself, where you're taking on less, or you're taking on something that is not truly in alignment with what you want for some reason. And I'll give some examples because it's probably more helpful for you if I do that. But for example, maybe in the workplace, you have been invited to join a committee, and it's a committee that is not really up your alley. It's not something that you're truly passionate about, and you've already committed to a number of other things, and this would really not be furthering you along the path that you want to follow. But the person who's asking you is really excited about it. They really want to have you on the team. They really love the work that you're doing. And so you may get caught up in their enthusiasm, and you may be tempted to go and take on that project. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't take on the project, but I would invite you to really check in with your gut, to ask yourself, is this something that you truly want to partake in? And if it's not, to allow yourself to not go ahead with that. Or if you do decide to take it on, knowing that it's not truly in alignment with what you want, that your gut reaction was that maybe you should not be doing this. So it's not so much that you need to always follow your gut, but it's really that exercise of listening to your gut. Another example that might come up is not really going after what you truly want. So you may think in your current context, whether it's something that you're doing at work that is not really something that you want to be doing, you've been doing it for whatever reason, is to ask yourself whether you want to continue to do that, right? It's like maybe you've been, this is kind of a bizarre example, but maybe you've been buying the soap that you don't really like because it's at a discount, but what you really want is this other soap that's more expensive. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is to treat yourself to the better soap. And I know that's kind of a weird example. It's the only one I'm coming up with right now, unfortunately. But rather than settle for something that's not really what you want, I'm encouraging you to get really clear about what it is that you do want and start dialing things in so that you're getting closer to that. And so figure out, and part of the webinar that I'm doing this week, if you do miss this webinar and you want an access to the recording, send me a note because I think it's going to be really impactful. Part of the exercise there is really reimagining your practice in a way that you want your practice to unfold. And so much of the material that I share on my podcast, you've probably noticed if you've been listening, is about really getting back in connection with yourself. I think as lawyers, as professionals, as women who are operating in professional environments and social environments where we really are seeking out to please others and to follow rules. We're not all going to fall into these categories, and certainly not for all aspects of our lives. But I think it can be really easy to get caught up in the checks and balances that others are setting up for us. And I'm not saying that we should remove ourselves from those external measures entirely, but I really think it's important to check back in with ourselves and make sure that we're on the right track for us. So that's really the takeaway here. For the third takeaway is listen to your gut and ask yourself whether, if your gut is telling you something, is it time for you to take action on that right now? So sorry, I got a little bit off track there, but that was the third lesson that I pulled from this, was to really listen to myself. The fourth lesson is that when you make a decision and you find yourself ruminating, is to try to limit that rumination and to realize that it has limits on how helpful it's going to be. So for example, doing some research on Google, not a big deal, but maybe this has happened to you where you've made a decision on a file and then you find yourself, researching after the fact, trying to decide if it was the right decision. Maybe you make a decision in your professional work or in your, a decision that affects your children, and you find yourself out there opinion shopping. Opinion shopping is a little bit dangerous because everyone's going to have their own view based on their own experience. And so what I would invite you to do there is, rather than go opinion shopping and spending a lot of time ruminating and second guessing yourself, maybe take some time to journal out what it is that is bothering you. Maybe speak with somebody about that. You could obviously speak with a coach or a counselor or whoever might be helpful for you. A family member, a friend. Maybe it is useful to give yourself a certain amount of time to have that conversation, but then to really try to put that conversation away, particularly if it's not serving your end, if it's not taking you any steps forward, it's kind of just distracting you from doing something that is more significant and important for you. So that was the fourth one. And the final lesson that came out of that is ultimately to have faith in yourself. And if there's anything that you take from this particular podcast episode, it is that I would love for all of you listening to really have faith that whatever decision you've made, it was the right decision. And it may not seem like the right decision at the time, but it is a decision that you made and you get to stand by it. You get to have your own back. If you need to make another decision in the future, you can do that. But rather than get wrapped up in self-doubt and, in this case, it's, why did I go and buy the $5 paint? Not really a big deal, but you can see how with bigger decisions, how there may be that temptation to ask yourself, why did I do this? This was such a dumb thing to do. Obviously, anybody with their mind on properly would have seen this coming. I'm encouraging you never, ever to go down that path, to allow yourself to be there for yourself and to have faith in the decisions that you make. So those are the takeaways that I wanted to share with you that come out of my painting experience. And yeah, the room looks way better. And I am getting used to the paint smell. The paint smell is dissipating. I'm 100% confident that it was the right thing to do, and that if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had this wonderful opportunity to think about decisions, to think about how we can second guess our decisions, and to feel more confident going forward that the decisions that I'm making are fine. They are the right decisions, and how you might apply that in your practice, how I am going to apply that in my practice. These are all things that I would encourage you to think about. So, my friends, it has been an honor to have you here today. I hope this little story was was at least amusing, if not somewhat helpful for you. And I really, really do hope to see you at my next webinars. Again, there will be a webinar on November 12th, which is all about decluttering. As I mentioned, I'm doing my own decluttering project. I'm excited to talk to you more about that. It is a truly impactful exercise, the decluttering process, what is left behind, the choices that you're going to be making. I highly encourage you to tune in for that. And then on December 3rd, I'm super excited to talk about amplifying your impact. And the inspiration for that particular webinar comes from my own coaching practice, where I'm at a point now where I've been doing this for a few years and really looking at the parts of my practice that I really love and trying to figure out how to do more of those things. And the parallel in your practice, of course, is the same. It's to start looking at your legal practice, start looking at the relationships that you have with your colleagues, with your professional relationships, and decide how you can go about intentionally creating more of what you want and acting on those things. So, my friends, thank you again for joining me. I really do hope to see you at the webinars, and I hope you will tune back in next week. Again, if you did want to sign up for those webinars, I would encourage you to go to the webpage for the particular podcast episode. You'll find the links there. And if you have any trouble with that, just reach out on LinkedIn, reach out by email. I'd be happy to send those to you. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and have a wonderful week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.